Yeah, and it's interesting. We get these. History can be very politicized for various reasons, and weaponized in some cases. And you talk about James Douglas, and you'll often hear in the press, as much as he does or doesn't come up in the press and media, and that he's blamed for what were called the Douglas Treaties in the southern part of Vancouver Island. Yet, his real efforts were to try and protect Aboriginal people, and I think you talk about that in one of your videos, don't you?
Oh yeah, no, he was chosen by the British government. Maryvale was the head of the colonial department, and he was a very fierce critic of the British colony model, and he was in Oxford and gave these lectures and was just trashed, the British system, and so they made him the head of it. And he brought in the new model, which, he said you cannot allow the democracy to be responsible for the Indigenous people. You had to give that to the executive power of the governor, and they put James Douglas in charge, and he did do incredible things for the Native people. And recently there was a group of activists that wanted to knock down the statue of James Douglas, who was put in the government house in the Lieutenant Governor's mansion. And they went to the Lieutenant Governor asking, let's get rid of that statue, that old black racist, I guess. And the Lieutenant Governor said, well, you're going to have to ask the Lieutenant Governor who put it up, which was the first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor, Stephen Point.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that to Stephen Point, and he had a good belly laugh about that, that it was Stephen Point who put up that statue of James Douglas in honor of his approach to the Indigenous people, and he thought that guy had it right, and he sent out the surveyors to all of the villages and said, you have the Indigenous people themselves point out the reserve that they want, ask them what land they need. Draw a line around it, and then just say you can also preempt land as individuals off reserve, but you're also going to have to compete with other people. And he was told by Lytton, the colonial secretary, he said, you will attract settlers without regard to nation. Without regard to nation. He said this is meant to be a multicultural place, as long as they're willing to, live under British law, and that you should attract everybody. And of course, James Douglas went down to San Francisco, or sent somebody down and brought up 600 to 800 black people who then came up, who were at that time, heavily discriminated against. And so they came up, and James Douglas treated them very well, and they were very successful. They became leaders of the community. And but after that, when we got democracy, actually, I'm sad to say, they were less. And once Douglas was gone, that was a problem for them. But it was quite an amazing history of our province.
Interesting point when you're talking about Governor Douglas and his statue, because statues seem to have become a focal point for all sorts of political attention these days. And one of the other, let's talk about Gassy Jack Dayton. Just a little while ago, his statue was torn down, claimed to have been torn down by the Downtown East Side Association on a particular march, and for reasons that were presented in the press as influencing a lot of people into believing that he was a certain type of a person, but let's talk about him for a little bit, because there's some real history that is generally ignored in the media.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember John Dayton, Gassy Jack. He was actually quite disabled by the time he got to New Westminster, and he was a steamboat captain. Often was on crutches. So he had married a Squamish woman, and in New Westminster they lived, and and invited in his mother-in-law and his wife's cousin into the home. So right away, as soon as somebody's living with their mother-in-law, they're my hero. You know, I would never do it. No one that I know would live with their mother-in-law, but anybody who will do it, my hat's off. You know, so there he was living with his mother-in-law and her cousin, who needed a place to stay as well. So now Gassy Jack was very entrepreneurial. He had to really, you really had to. There was no support, no government support for anything. So basically, he figured, there's this mill on the north side of Burrard Inlet, and then you got the Hastings Mill on the south side, and all these mill workers, and both of the mills were anti-alcohol. So he thought, wow, a bunch of guys with money. I think I'm gonna give a crack at this. So he bought a big whiskey barrel, and the wife's cousin rowed the boat down, a rowboat down with his wife and mother-in-law, and they were going to row right around, Point Grey. But the wind and the storm came up, so he stopped at the end of the river and sent the family off to find some food. They ended up meeting some Musqueam people and went back to there and stayed overnight and left him in the rain. He couldn't even get his matches to get his pipe lit or anything. So anyways, when they came back the next morning, they brought food and he forgave them. And so they continued rowing around and then got right at the edge of the Hastings Mill property, which is, you could not have alcohol on their property. So right at the edge was Carroll and Water. And Maple Tree Square, he set up, his wife and mother-in-law set up a tent, put a whiskey barrel in the middle. All the mill workers sat around, and a couple tin cups, and they all passed around and enjoyed their first glass of whiskey in many, many years. And so anyways, what happened was they were so pleased about it, and they asked him, when are we going to be able to do this again? And he says, well, if only I could get a little building here, a saloon, I would be able to give you whiskey whenever you wanted. And so they all volunteered to make this very first building in Vancouver. And that was the saloon. And so he went up on the roof with his Union Jack and said, here we are, I'm able to have a Squamish wife, I'm able to have a mixed marriage, multiracial family. I wouldn't be able to do this, or certainly not very easily down south. And so I'm so happy to be here living under British law. They all sang God Save the Queen, went and had a drink. And so that was the very first. And so what happened in Vancouver is if you ever go to the 100 block where it's zero, if you follow the 100 blocks, north, south, east, west, and you'll find the 100 blocks, they all eventually converge down to that pub. And basically that's where the city grew, around that saloon. And the city actually grew around that family too. Vancouver's first family was the Squamish wife and the mother-in-law and the cousin. So it's interesting that when a few years later his wife was very sick and she was dying, and so the mother-in-law asked her granddaughter to come help with the wife as she was dying, and they agreed with the father of the granddaughter. They all agreed, the family, that she would become Gassy Jack's wife when the first wife died. And so that's what everybody gets all upset about, some lecherous old racist or whatever. Absolutely not. It was an indigenous decision by that family that she should take over from the dying wife. And they claim she was 12 years old. She wasn't 12 years old. We have two documents. The 1881 census say she was 25 in 1881, meaning she was born in 1856, which would have made her between 14 and 15 when she was married, which is not uncommon, and especially in Indigenous communities of the time, and even in the non-Indigenous communities. Emily Patterson, the first nurse in Vancouver, her daughter got married at 15 as well, you know. So this was a, you know, people are engaged in presentism, the judgment of the past by the values of the present. And it's so interesting to see people judging this Indigenous family on their colonial values, you know, like what's going on there, you know.
Yeah.
So anyways, this was Vancouver's first family, a multicultural, multiracial family. You know, clearly the grandmother supported the granddaughter marrying Jack. She was a fan of his. He took her in to her home, to his home, and they lived together. And it's interesting, the part that shocked me actually, I just found out recently, was the guy who rowed the boat down the river and, you know, helped them and lived in the house of Gassy Jack, became the second husband of his second wife in Squamish, you know. He also became a constable in the North Shore, partly because of the connections of Gassy Jack, you know. So this was a family that was close, and you know, it's a shame that he's been insulted, not only him, but the Indigenous family, by these people who, like in the old days, very quick to judge. They make immediate discriminatory conclusions about this mixed race family.
Yeah.
And you know, all the things that they criticize the old times for, discrimination, quick to judge, hypocrisy, is right in them themselves.
Well, I think your term presentism is so appropriate these days, because we've gone, the pendulum swings back and forth always. There's cycles to everything, but we've gone so far over to one side that there's all of these purity tests out there, and people don't actually take the time to do the research, to find out what the facts were. And again, with the term presentism, to go back and try and figure out what the values and the morals and the mores were of that time, and how it all worked. Because as far as I know, as you said, you know, that actually wasn't uncommon to get married at that age in any society in the world, just about. You know, it's,
remember, that's a time when the average lifespan was 35, and almost half of all Indigenous children did not make it to adulthood.